Robin Fail is a doctoral student at the Duke Marine Lab. Her research is guided by an interest in how social systems and marine ecosystems interact, the governance structures used to moderate those interactions, and the process of integrating diverse values, knowledge systems, and priorities into policymaking. Her dissertation research focuses on politics and policies related to aquaculture development and the equity implications of policy trade-offs in the sector. She is also a Global Justice and Equity Fellow this semester, so please join me in welcoming Robin.
Everybody. Thanks, Erin. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming today, in the rain, no less. My name is Robin, and I am in my 5th year of my PhD at the Duke Marine Lab. And it's a real pleasure to be here today and talk to you about my dissertation research, which is about diverse values and social conflict and policy preferences in aquaculture in the U.S. state of Maine. I'll start today by just going over some basics about aquaculture to get us all on the same page about what it is, what it means, the types of things we're thinking about. And then I'll get into my research, which will start with a discussion about how aquaculture issues are framed in discourse about aquaculture, the different values that people are bringing to these discussions. Then we'll get into different perspectives about how growth should proceed and policy preferences for that growth. And then I'll talk to you about equity considerations and the things I'm thinking about when I sort of envision possibilities for equitable development of this sector. Okay, so baseline definition of aquaculture. This is from NOAA. Aquaculture is the breeding, rearing, and harvesting of fish, shellfish, algae, and other organisms in all types of water environments. So it can happen in freshwater, it can happen in saltwater, but mariculture is the technical word for aquaculture that's happening in saltwater, and my research is all about mariculture. It's the farming of fish that's happening in that coastal zone, but commonly people just sort of use aquaculture to talk about it all, and that's the word I'm going to use, but know that as I talk about it, I really mean mariculture. And mariculture practices are ancient. There's evidence of them dating back to 2000 BC in China. There's a lot of indigenous practices that sort of mirror today's aquaculture practices, but obviously the technology involved and the scale of it has all changed a lot in the modern era. Globally, already more than half of the world's seafood supply comes from aquaculture, and so as various wild stocks of fish have plateaued or plummeted in the face of overfishing and climate change and water quality degradation, aquaculture has filled that gap. The population just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and there's a bigger and bigger demand for seafood, and aquaculture is really what's supplying that seafood. And so if you are someone who eats seafood, unless you are really actively trying to only eat wild-caught seafood, it's very likely that what you're encountering in restaurants or grocery stores has been farmed as a product of aquaculture. And so I'm studying this in the state of Maine. And Maine is a really interesting place to study this. We have a few Mainers in the audience, which is very exciting. But for one thing, it has a huge coastline. Maine has 3,500 miles of coastline with all of its little islands and bays. And so it's got a lot of coastal area to do this. Maine also has cold, clean waters that support a wide variety of aquacultured species. So unlike North Carolina, which largely, if you're talking about aquaculture in North Carolina, you're thinking oysters, and they have some questionable successes. Maine can support salmon and oysters and mussels and seaweed. And so it has a wider variety of species growing in its waters, which, as I will get to, comes with a variety of social reactions and considerations. And Maine is also really important because it has a really rich maritime heritage and identity, a long history of wild fishing, and so the ways that that interacts with this developing aquaculture sector are really important and interesting and important parts of value considerations for policymakers making decisions in this space. Here's Maine. That shows where it is in the US. I want to go over some fundamentals about sort of how aquaculture is regulated. So it's regulated by the State Department of Marine Resources. Just broad overview, waters in the US are typically managed from the low tide mark out to 12 miles by the state, from 12 miles to 200 by the federal government, and from the federal government onward, it's the high seas or areas beyond national jurisdiction. And so I'm talking about, my work is all happening in that span of coastal water that is managed by the state. But because it's managed by the state, it's the public commons. It belongs to all of us. And so that is a really interesting consideration when you think about how conflict about aquaculture might differ from, say, agriculture. It's not happening in private space. It's happening in public space. And so that shapes reception to this sector as well. And when farmers go to the Department of Marine Resources to apply for a lease, in which they will start their farm, that lease is effectively privatizing that water, at least for a temporary period of time. There are certainly agreements between growers and fishers about being able to use the same space, but that grower has authority over that space and can keep other people out. And for each lease approved, there's a lease hearing. So that is the public's opportunity to provide input. People are supposed to be notified by DMR that a lease hearing is coming up. They can sign up to give comments and feedback and share their opinion about why the department should or should not approve that lease. And that is sort of the key site for public participation in this space. But DMR is held to certain criteria by which they really are supposed to make that decision. So, for example, if the space in question is a proven fishing ground, it's historically used by wild fishers, and they have proven that, DMR isn't allowed to approve the lease. However, something like viewshed, it's common for there to be people who don't want to look at a new aquaculture farm from their property or their home. A consideration like viewshed is not in the leasing criteria, and so DMR cannot deny a lease on the basis of viewshed. So there's certain things that are by law recognized as reasons you could or cannot approve a lease. And then this table is probably boring, but it gives a breakdown of the different types of leases that exist in Maine. This is state specific, so it looks different in every state. There's sort of 3 different levels based on size and duration. The limited purpose aquaculture leases, there are a bunch of them, over 700 in Maine. Those are really tiny. They're mostly for sort of experimenting, learning what you're gonna grow, figuring things out. They're not commercial yet. You're not running a commercial operation. By the time you get to experimental and standard, those are larger leases, and they last a lot longer. You can have them for a lot longer. And a standard lease can be up to 100 acres. And for comparison's sake, in North Carolina, the maximum acreage a lease can be is 10 acres. So it's pretty different. And one individual can lease up to 10 standard leases. So in theory, one individual entity or person could lease up to 1,000 acres of ocean space. That isn't happening, but it is possible under law. This shows a map of active experimental and standard leases in Maine right now. It's a little deceptive because it looks like it's sort of everywhere, and that isn't how it looks from the coastline in Maine. Those of you who are from there can attest to this. You're not just seeing farms everywhere you look. But they span the coastline. The average lease size is 10 acres. Over half of leases operate on less than 5 acres. The vast majority of them are shellfish and seaweed leases. So when we're talking about this, we're going to talk a lot about salmon farming and its role in social conflict. But of the 165 standard and experimental leases that are currently active, 25% of those are owned by the corporate entity that owns all the salmon farms, and all the rest are shellfish and seaweed. And we're going to get to Cook Aquaculture and sort of their role in this conflict. These are some pictures just to give you an idea of what aquaculture can look like. So on the left, these are pictures I took of an experimental scallop farm that I visited. The bag is showing the cage that they're kept in, and the different tier. They grow in the different tiers of the cage based on size. They're living in the water column, eating whatever nutrients they come upon in the water or that pass their way in the water. The top is an angry scallop. What you're seeing is actually like the reproductive gland. We eat the adductor muscle of scallops, but that's what one looks like. The middle pictures are from a salmon farm I visited in far northeast Maine. The land you can see in the background is actually Canada, but these are in Maine. And the top picture shows a salmon farm that is owned and operated by Cook Aquaculture. And they're pretty big, and they have netting. They're containing the fish inside of them, but they're growing in the open ocean. The water's flowing freely. And then the bottom is a delicing vessel. So one of the things that can happen when salmon are grown in high density is they have a propensity to get sea lice that can really degrade their health. It can be passed to wild populations, and so they sometimes need to be deliced. This vessel goes in and scoops up the fish and cleans them and then deposits them in a clean net. This is a picture I took at a hatchery of some oyster larvae. These get grown out to a little bit bigger and then sold to farmers. So if you're a shellfish farmer, you're buying your seed from somewhere, from a hatchery. And then this picture I didn't take, but it's of the Duke Aqua Farm. Duke actually leases an oyster farm in North Carolina close to the Marine Lab. And you can go out every Friday and help clean cages and harvest oysters. And it's fun, and you should all do it if you're ever at the Marine Lab. But you can see that's a bag that holds oysters, and they float at the top of the water. And you have to like go in and scrape muck off them and check on the oysters, but that's what it looks like. The left image is algae tanks growing in a hatchery. The seed that is used, like the shellfish seeds, have to eat algae. And so these are different types of algae being grown to feed them. That's me with some kelp. And then this is an experimental thing I saw a seaweed farmer doing. These are called mycobuoys, but they're buoys made out of fungus instead of plastic. And the idea is that they'll just degrade in the water over time. They're totally biodegradable. They get rid of some of the plastic waste involved in aquaculture. Okay, so before I dive into the depths of my research, I think it's important to just talk about the differences between public perception of shellfish and seaweed aquaculture compared to salmon. Because though I'm talking about all of this under the umbrella of aquaculture, they're really quite different. And they require really different inputs, and they have really different outputs. So shellfish and kelp are filter feeders and photosynthesizers. Salmon needs to be fed. They're carnivores, omnivores maybe, I don't know. But you have to feed them. And historically, a huge proportion of that feed comes in the form of fish meal, which requires fishing tiny fish like sardines and then drying it and grinding it up to create fish meal. And then that can cause a lot of environmental problems like trophic cascades when all of the little fish that the big fish eat disappear, then the big fish starve, then the bigger predators starve. So it can create lots of problems. There has been a lot of technological innovation in the last 20 years to try to transition fish feed to a higher proportion of plant-based products, and that is happening. I think right now in Maine, the salmon farms say that 90% of their feed is plant-based and 10% is aquatic organism-based. And some of it has to be because they won't be healthy if they're not eating aquatic organisms, which is their natural diet. But it's intensive. And then another big difference is environmental impact. So shellfish are they're filter feeders. They're eating the nutrients that come their way in the water column. And a common stat is that an adult oyster can filter 50 gallons of water a day, so just one. And so there's a lot of arguments that growing out the shellfish aquaculture industry will really help with water quality and counter environmental damage from all sorts of other development. And then kelp are photosynthesizers. They're using carbon and turning it into CO2. There's a lot of interest in the potential of seaweed farms to really be a major carbon sequestration tactic in the coming years. Salmon can harm water quality. That's not a given, but it can. Salmon poop, and if there's not good water flow, then that can build up. And then they can also pose a risk to wild populations if they escape, which does happen sometimes, especially if a big storm messes with a net or something. If they escape, they can pass disease to wild populations. If they need to be fed antibiotics, that gets into the water and spreads through the ecosystem. They're typically genetically modified, and so when they breed with wild populations, if they escape, that causes some people alarm in terms of what that means about sort of preserving the genetic stock of wild fish. And then all of these differences about the different inputs they require mean that they operate at really different scales. And so shellfish and seaweed farms, the average lease size in Maine is 8 acres versus the average lease size for salmon is 25 acres. Salmon just need more space. And then that also lends itself to requiring different forms of ownership. And so shellfish and seaweed are largely owner-operated in Maine, whereas this one corporation, Cook, owns all of the salmon farms. And it wasn't always that way. In the 80s, when salmon farms were first sort of taking off, I think it was 26 family-owned farms families owned all the salmon farms. And then at some point, it became far more efficient and viable business-wise for them to sell to Cook, and the industry consolidated. And there's really mixed feelings about Cook. I'm sure Steve could tell us a lot about that living in Jonesport. But there's really mixed reception. Some people think they're doing a wonderful job and that they are beholden to strict environmental standards that really do protect the water and the communities. And other people are really skeptical of them and feel that there's not transparency about their practices. And they, we'll sort of talk more about corporate ownership in time. But then the final difference that I think is worth noting is that shellfish and kelp leases span the coast, sort of the whole coastline has them, whereas the salmon farms are concentrated in down east Maine, which is the northeasternmost segment of the coast. And there have been some proposals in recent years to start salmon farms further south in wealthier communities where there's more tourism, and those have been like vehemently opposed by the community. And so there are questions about NIMBYism and sort of who gets to make decisions about where these are sited and how. And the opposition has all come from the communities where it's based, and communities in Down East have been more receptive to that. But it raises a lot of questions about sort of why and how and power dynamics. Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of these. Aquaculture can be contentious because of access to sea space. Other people want to use the water. There's a lot of lobstermen and other wild harvesters in Maine vying for the same space. Contested environmental impact, we talked about that. Contested nutritional benefit is interesting. So there's a lot of questions about whether wild seafood is better for you. The science is still working on it. And I think a lot of that depends. It depends on what they eat. It depends on the pollutants they're exposed to. And then questions about who the food produced is for. So a lot of aquaculture proponents talk about its capacity for food security. Right now, the U.S. imports 90% of its seafood. And so people talk about this as a way to really boost the domestic production of U.S. seafood. And it certainly is. But then I guess that raises the question of who that food is for. Like, are salmon and oysters the food security, or are they food for fancy restaurants on the East Coast? Privatization of the commons and enclosure of ocean space, we've talked about that. And then fear of corporate consolidation. So that's not only enabled because aquaculture leases allow you to sell them and consolidate them, unlike lobster licenses. Lobster licenses can't be sold. They can't be transferred to someone else. So it's virtually impossible to like consolidate lobster licenses under a corporate entity. But that's not the case with aquaculture. And their fear of corporate consolidation is not crazy. This is just a picture from Amazon's website, as in Amazon.com. A year ago, they funded the first huge commercial-scale seaweed farm. This is a CGI image of it. It doesn't exist yet. But this is in the North Sea in the Netherlands. They're proposing that they'll build out these huge seaweed farms between the wind turbines. The North Sea is really highly industrialized already, a lot of mixed use, a lot of development within that sea. And they're talking about this as just like a huge step to the carbon sequestration we need to combat climate change. But we also don't have the science on it. We don't have seaweed farms of this scale. We don't know what it does when you plant out this amount of ocean with a crop that wasn't there previously. So there are concerns about that, even though there is also reason to believe that, sure, it could do some of the carbon work it claims to do. And then people have a lot of feelings about a company like Amazon buying exclusive access to sea space that belongs to all of us. Okay, this is setting us up to think about conflict in Maine. So on the left, those are two pictures I took about saving the Maine lobstermen. And this is to give you the political context for why one of the reasons lobstermen are engaged in this debate about aquaculture, and some of them are opposed to it. Not all of them by any stretch of the imagination. But there's a movement right now in Maine that is about saving the Maine lobstermen, and that isn't actually about aquaculture. That is about the North Atlantic right whale, which is a highly endangered whale that spends part of the year off of Maine's coast, and it's migratory. So one was just found dead yesterday, I think, in Georgia. It moves. But the federal government is obligated under the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act to take measures to prevent deaths of this species. That is what those acts do. And so one of the ways that right whales die is getting entangled in fishing gear. There's been a lot of debate about whose fishing gear is responsible for this. But in reaction to that, the federal government has proposed major regulation on Maine lobstermen, which would require them to take huge proportions of their gear out of the water. And essentially for some people that would mean like making their business inviable. It wouldn't be possible to make a livelihood on it. So they're already feeling threatened from regulation in that sense. And so while at the same time, there's this sense of enclosure that they're being boxed out of certain places in the ocean, that creates more and more tension. I took this photo of just someone's house. This is a sign, and this is a protest related to the same project proposed a couple of years ago in the waters of Frenchman Bay, which are the waters surrounding Acadia National Park. And this proposal was for a huge corporate salmon farm owned, not a Cook-owned one. It was a Norwegian company calling themselves American Aqua Farms. Sketchy. And it was going to be huge. And this boat is these are a flotilla protest, so the boats are all out there in protest, and they're making a circle to show the size of like one of the proposed spaces that this farm would have taken up of many. And I mean, it would have been like visible from any hike in Acadia. And so people were pissed about it. And in response to that, a lot of towns in Maine have passed moratoria saying that they won't allow any more leasing in their waters. That is not recognized by law. They don't have the legal right to do that. It's up to the state's DMR, but they're doing it as a form of protest and to send a signal to the state that they're really done. Okay, so finally, what is my research about? It is about, I'm interested in how diverse values and beliefs are competing for space in this conflict and how they're expressed. I'm interested in how different stakeholders in this debate define the problem differently and how they're seeing the problem of what aquaculture can or can't do differently. And I'm interested in how state policies driving aquaculture development are elevating certain values and beliefs about aquaculture and not others, and what that might mean as we think about a future of this industry and whether or not we want to consider equity as we build that future. So the first chapter of my dissertation is a discourse analysis in which I'm looking at how competing parties in this debate frame the issue of aquaculture and the values and beliefs that they're communicating when they're talking about aquaculture. And I did this doing a discourse analysis of news media in Maine, Maine-based newspapers in the past 5 years, articles about aquaculture. These are just some headlines to sort of show you the diversity of stuff that's out there, but some of them are about limiting salmon aquaculture. Some of them are about salmon escapes. One of them is the Maine Aquaculture Association battling the New York Times because of how they reported on salmon farming and saying that they had inaccurate details. Some call aquaculture an economic bright spot with growing demand. So you can see this contention playing out just in headlines. And so one of the things I was interested in looking at in this analysis was how issues are framed. And frames are, I'm thinking of frames as how we see the world. They're the lenses we use for defining and understanding what a given dispute is about and what is at stake in an argument. And these are examples of frames that I was looking for, and these are pulled from environmental conflict literature. Basically, in most conflicts about natural resources, we have competing values and we have competing desires for what the outcome is and who, competing perceptions of who deserves access to what. And so these frames are often used in environmental conflict. And some frames can be used to talk about who you are and your identity or who someone else is and sort of paint the portrait of the enemy. Frames can be used to talk about how you want the conflict mediated and who should be responsible for solving it. They are used to talk about who the winners and losers are of a given situation or to communicate risk and who is at risk of what danger. And so here's examples of frames that I found in the news media just to give you an idea of how this translates. So first is risk frames. These are used to sort of define what the problem is and who is at risk. And at the top you see Maine aquaculture being described as environmental stewardship, sustainable, eco-friendly, climate-friendly. And below that, Maine aquaculture is described as ground zero, greenwashed, an environmental calamity, dirty. This is the same exact project that this is about. And then conflict management frame, an example of that, you hear someone's describing the DMR hearing officer as ignoring the permitting rules and testimony and the will of the people and having conflicts of interest. And then someone else is describing the same DMR as the product of 40 years of public discussions, a role model, rigorous, effective, fair, and balanced. So you see how there might be a problem. And And so what I found in this was sort of two things. One is that there's these really binary, polarized, competing discourses. There is aquaculture as a threat and aquaculture as a solution. And that might be aquaculture as a threat to working waterfronts and to maritime culture and heritage, to the future of fishermen's livelihoods. It might be that it's a threat to the environment or to wild species. And then there's aquaculture as a solution, which talks about its capacity for climate resilience, it being a sustainable source of protein, job diversification opportunities for people in maritime industries that may not have much of a future in the face of climate change, and promising horizons of economic opportunity. There's a lot of hope that aquaculture really does provide valuable income and jobs in communities that really need it. And then I also coded these articles for the values that were communicated in them. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but the point here is sort of like there's a lot of values at stake in this and that are coming to the table, and they are things beyond economics. And so when we talk about the future of aquaculture, we talk a lot about maximizing profit and maximizing production, but there's a lot of other things at stake in that conversation as well. And so part of what I wanted to do with this chapter is offer up an understanding of how we frame the issues, because if you do that, it enables opportunities for reframing. And this is the very idealistic part of this chapter that wishes to give policymakers a way to move forward in the face of polarization. But reframing is a process of perspective taking and mediation in which you really focus on commonalities instead of differences. And I do think that this research, and I'll talk about this more in the next section, but one of my hopes is to highlight both areas of commonality and areas of nuance. If we keep talking about this in only polarized terms, we're very unlikely to make any progress or find any resolution. But if we focus on areas of nuance, like the size of a lease or the species or where a lease is sited, there are all these opportunities for nuance. And perhaps by focusing on them, we can create new framing together. And so the next chapter really gets at that search for nuance. And so I'm interested in studying how competing values create diverse perspectives about aquaculture and how that shapes policy preferences for the sector. And I did this using something called the Q method. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that method, but happy to talk about it after if you want. I find it very fascinating. It's a mixed methods, qualitative, quantitative approach, the goal of which is to look for groups of thought among a group of stakeholders. And there's a 5-step process, not going to go into those details, but I approached the participants of this study with 48 statements that were value-based statements about aquaculture, and I'll give you an example on the next slide of what some of those statements were. But I asked them to sort it on this matrix according to what statements best represent their perspective about aquaculture. And so they have to pick, the two that absolutely most, above all, represent their perspective, and the two that they absolutely hate, could not disagree with more. And then everything that comes to the middle is more and more neutral. And so then after I do this with all of the participants, I ran a quantitative factor analysis that is looking for statistically significant patterns of thought within these statements. So, this statement about scale is always paired with this statement about environmental impact or something like that. And so, I'll give you an example of some of the statements. So they're all based on a particular value or belief about aquaculture. The top one is about whether you think DMR is doing their job or whether they're ignoring the rules. There's one about food production and who it's really for. The industry claims that aquaculture is about food security, but really it's all wetting food. There's one about scale and protecting small growers. This one is about whether you think that the future of effective management is devolving decision-making power down to the communities or regions and doing regional-based management rather than statewide management. That's more akin to how lobster is managed. And then opponents of that, are like, no, that's NIMBY. Like, we're going to end up with all these socioeconomic power differentials that we already have. So these are examples of what they were sorting on that matrix. I did 40 of these with people in April to June of last year, all along coastal Maine. And the point in selecting people for the Q method is that you are selecting really diverse viewpoints. So I did this with people who are super gung-ho and optimistic about aquaculture, and I did this with people who absolutely hate it, and a lot of people in between. And And what I found, I'll talk us through this, but are 5 perspectives that had statistically significant groupings of thought. And I want you to think about, as I describe these, how this helps us understand where we can find nuance. This is in opposition to just aquaculture as threat versus aquaculture as solution. So these 5 groups, I came up with the names for them, but the first is the enthusiasts. And these are people who are really optimistic about aquaculture. They really think it's environmentally responsible, an excellent economic opportunity. It's just sort of like a win-win for everybody. And to them, the problem with aquaculture is that it's not growing fast enough, that DMR doesn't have the capacity to grow this business as quickly as it deserves to be grown. The second group is the reformers. These are people who are really critical of the current regulatory process. They're really, they fixate on scale and ownership. So how big is the farm, and is it corporate or is it owner operated? And to them, the problem is lack of public participation and the influence of special interests. There's a lot of talk about the power and influence of venture capitalists and well-funded lobbyists in Maine aquaculture. And that is me sort of reporting out on that. I do not know the truth of any of that. I don't know how the money flows. But I do know that a lot of people feel really upset about it. And so this group in particular is really concerned about special interests. The group I call finfish fanatics, these are people who, when you hear aquaculture, they think of salmon farming. They're not, that is what they focus on. They're staunchly opposed to it. They see it as really environmentally hazardous. And while they support small-scale shellfish and seaweed farming, to them the problem is that salmon aquaculture exists at all, and that corporate interests are driving its ongoing persistence. The shellfish optimists are sort of same thing but different. When they hear aquaculture, they're thinking of it in terms of shellfish and its possibilities to fulfill these promises of some economic opportunity and really be environmentally sustainable. And to them, the problem is this focus on corporate growth that the state seems to have in receiving more and more corporate bids for aquaculture, and a conflation with salmon farming, which they feel like really holds them back from realizing some growth because people hold a line where they're just against aquaculture without sort of letting them be separate. And then the final perspective is the restorationist, and this is someone who really prioritizes wild salmon over all else and is really supportive of aquaculture because of its potential restorative capacity. And so to them, the problem is lack of adequate attention on restoration possibilities and how aquaculture might be a really important tool for helping wild populations recover. Okay, so key takeaways from this are one, that I think both of these chapters together highlight how aquaculture debates are really ideological conflicts and not something likely to be solved by something like marine spatial planning, which says, okay, you get this space, you get this space, a logistical or a spatial resolution. These are ideological, emotional conflicts that get at really deeply held values about humans' relationship to nature, about your identity and livelihood, about existential crisis in light of climate change. So if we're proposing only solutions that don't acknowledge the ideological nature of these conflicts, it's gonna keep being there. And then two, my sort of most idealistic hope for this work would be that it's a starting point for constructive policy dialogue. As I have said, I think that it illuminates areas of nuance and pull us out of that polarized way of talking about it. I think scale and ownership are central issues here where there is room to focus on nuance and sort of find some compromise. I also put fairness there because there's a lot of talk of people saying, well, you're prioritizing aquaculture over wild fisheries, or wild fisheries are allowed to do this, but aquaculturists aren't. And so there's clearly something there where people value fair treatment, even if they're not totally getting what they want. Just the fact that they feel fairly treated by the law is important. And then a need for species differentiation. I think in both how we talk about it and how we manage it, it's clear that the sort of monolith of aquaculture is failing to recognize a lot of important nuance in this conversation. And so that takes me to my last chapter, which is about how values and priorities are mobilized in the actual policies, the bills proposed by the state legislature that regulate aquaculture and what this might mean about equitable management. And I'm working on this chapter now, and so I don't have results to share, but I will show you something. This is how I'm thinking about equity. This is a framework for equity that is commonly used in environmental justice literature, but it thinks about equity in 3 dimensions. There's distribution, basically how burdens and benefits are distributed between different groups of people. There's procedure, which is about inclusive and effective participation and people feeling heard. There's recognition, which is about acknowledging the legitimacy of different rights and worldviews and values, and all of those are embedded in the enabling conditions or the institutional context in which a given debate is taking place. And so what I'm doing in this chapter is a policy analysis where I'm doing qualitative coding of bills from the last 5 years that the state legislature has put forward to manage aquaculture, and the almost 1,000 pieces of testimony that the public have submitted in response to those bills, and looking for what the public wants the state to manage for compared to what the state is managing for, and how the different dimensions of equity sort of map to those concerns. It's super interesting so far, and I don't have results from it, but last summer I worked on an article with a group of people who all live in Maine, working in the aquaculture sector, and they're all really interested in a visioning process for the state that really thinks about equity and getting away from special interests, and they are very these people probably fall somewhere in the reformers and the shellfish optimist realm. Like, they're very pro shellfish and seaweed, but they want some changes to be made in DMR's process for doing things. And we did some of this. We did a testimony analysis as far as seeing who, in terms of organizations, was participating in the legislative process, and did they get what they want. And we published that paper in January, so you can read more about it if you want. And we also looked at, my piece of this was bill and testimony, but we also looked at who is getting grant funding, and what is the size of their operation, what species are they growing, what are they working on, and what are stated priorities of the different entities engaging in aquaculture in the state. But these are 2 figures from those results, and one of them shows how often the Maine Aquaculture Association and the Department of Marine Resources align in what they want from a given bill, and they aligned 87.5% of the time in the bills we analyzed, and in the two that they didn't align, it was very sort of minor regulatory clarity issues. They weren't sort of like really value-driven issues. And I don't think this is surprising because both of these entities are tasked with growing the aquaculture industry. But it's interesting. And if you think about sort of voices influencing the direction of the industry, I think this is relevant and important. And then this is just a breakdown of what the bills are trying to do as far as limiting or advancing aquaculture. And we have more interesting figures in there sort of showing, okay, this percentage of bills to limit aquaculture, this was proposed by Republicans, this was proposed by Democrats, this one passed, this one didn't. So we do have more detail in the paper, but this 31% of bills in the last 5 years aimed at limiting aquaculture is probably a response to projects like that American Aqua Farms project that has really gotten people freaked out. And there's a number of projects slated to happen. Oh, I should say that the American Aqua Farms project was denied. It did not happen. It isn't happening. And so that, I think, was an example of where public input was taken really seriously. And I read a statement from the head of DMR at the time who said, you know, basically their reason for denying it was a technicality based on their leasing criteria, but the head of DMR says in writing, like in public testimony, under no circumstances would I have approved this lease, which I think is really interesting because it's showing some sort of like himself in this regulatory process. Like, he is saying that it doesn't matter what the criteria was, it wasn't going to happen, sort of. And then I'll leave us here. This is a quote from an environmental justice paper I like a lot, but ultimately equity trade-offs are value-laden decisions that protagonists arrive at through a process of social contestation and political negotiation. And I think this quote sort of summarizes what I'm doing here. I'm interested in how we arrive at equitable governance because I think it's like a normative moral issue. But I think that those decisions are always going to be value-laden. And there's so much contestation about the science behind it and what is true and what isn't. And people really want there to be clear-cut facts, but that's not the case. This is based in value judgments and contextual things that vary lease by lease. And so I'm really interested in how those social contests play out, how the politics gets negotiated, and ultimately when and how we do and don't prioritize things other than economics. And so with that, I'll stop talking for a minute and take questions. Thanks for coming.
So we have one question online, so as I go across the room here. So the question online, it starts with, this is such a fascinating topic and really engaging presentation. I'm wondering whether there are different socioeconomic backgrounds associated with the 5 different positions on aquaculture that came out of the QDA analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know because I didn't collect data on each participant's socioeconomic status, their income, or anything like that. I do know where they worked, who they worked for. I know their race, I know their age, I know their gender. But I don't know something like income that would just sort of give me a straightforward answer to that question. But one of the things I was looking at, I made a point to have participants from Hancock County and Washington County, and Washington is in down East Maine where there is salmon farming, and there's a lot of lobstermen and a lot of lobster fishing, and it has higher unemployment, lower average income. It's an older population. It's far more rural. Hancock County is wealthier. It's way more involved in tourism. And I was looking to see, like, are there going to be patterns in where people are from based on this? I should say that the Q method is not designed to tell me that. So this was really me sort of looking for what I saw, but it's not something I could sort of report on scientifically. But the answer was no, I didn't actually see patterns. And not only that, but I didn't see patterns in, like, it wasn't like all growers, the farmers that I interviewed were in the first enthusiast bucket. They were spread out throughout them. So there was a lot more, whatever that sort of position you hold didn't necessarily predict which perspective you were going to have. Yeah.
Thanks, Robin. That was really beautiful, and thank you so much for so clearly describing what would otherwise be kind of a really difficult topic for me to understand. The survey question, or the survey that you reached out to those 40 people, was anyone from Cook? Is that the corporate, or the DMR? Was anyone from those two? Then I have a follow-up question.
Okay, yeah, you want to tell me?
I really appreciated your slide about kind of the key takeaways, and I think on that slide where you said what voices are being left out. Mm-hmm. So wondering if now in kind of reflection, if you had thoughts on which voices have been left out in this.
Yeah, great questions. So I tried to do the Q sort is what it's called when you do that sorting activity. And I tried to do that with someone from Cook, and they never got back to me. And I tried to do it. DMR did get back to me, but they were like, there is no way we have time for this. They are so understaffed and under capacity, and I understand. But I did do it with someone who works in the natural resources department. So I did it with a couple of people, and I did it with some people who are in the Maine Sea Grant office. They're like extension agents who work with sea farmers. And so they are technically government employees. So I did it with some government folks, but no one directly involved in those lease hearings. I did go to some lease hearings to get a sense of what they were like. And then, but I did it with people who are really familiar with Cook and sort of work closely with them. And though they aren't representing Cook, I can't say they're representing Cook's perspective, but there were certainly people who I think probably fairly closely approximated what I would expect someone who works at Cook to look like. And then as far as whose voices aren't present, that's an excellent question. And so we reflect on this some in that paper we wrote as far as saying, basically pointing to how the money and the actors participating all of the time in the policy making are large-scale entities. And that's both corporate entities or larger farms or special interest groups. There's sort of an ongoing fight between Sierra Club Maine and the Maine Aquaculture Association. And a lot of it boils down to sort of baseline arguments about like environmental protection versus economic opportunity. And that's like a persistent fight that will plague us for a long time to come, I think. But I was also really interested. So I did the Q sorts with a couple of indigenous people, and they raised issues to me of what's the statements that I gave them left out. And so in my paper about that, I write about what every person I did it with, I said, my attempt with those statements was to sort of cover the breadth of thought about aquaculture, but everyone who did it, I said, what did I leave out? What wasn't here? Like, what's something that's important to you that you don't see represented in these statements? And one of them that multiple people brought up was indigenous sovereignty and indigenous rights and how that interacts with governance here. And there are really interesting bill arguments happening in Maine right now about indigenous sovereignty and water rights, and they're not closely enough related to aquaculture to make it into my analysis, but that's something that I'm aware is missing. And then I think some people felt like voices were missing were those like most direly impacted by climate change, like people who, you know, no one agreeing to spend an hour with me to do the Q sort is like a subsistence fisher, like needing that day's work to be their dinner. And those voices are like very rarely represented in the testimony or engagement space at all as well.
This is a very stimulating topic. The house we owned in Maine for 20 years looked out onto Englishman Bay. And by August, there are so many lobster buoys on Englishman Bay, you could walk across it without getting wet. I've always been fascinated that lobster fishermen basically claim a patch of this wild space and say, this is mine, and only I can put my buoys here. So this concept of locking up a patch of ocean, it's not locked up in the same way as a salmon farm, but if you own a boat and you're trying to go across Englishman Bay in August, you have to be very careful.
Yeah.
You can get tangled up in gear all over the place. Has that, you know, considering how prevalent lobster fishing is in Maine, does that lead into your research? I mean, the concept of saying this is mine and not yours is kind of historically well established in Maine, and you would think lobster fishermen would be more sympathetic to the concept of an oyster farm or mussel farm.
Yeah, that's an excellent question and observation. One of the things that I find really interesting is people's different, this is off topic slightly, but people's different reactions to seeing a bay full of lobster buoys versus an oyster farm. Like, people think lobster buoys are so cute and like part of what you expect to see in a picturesque viewscape of Maine. And they're really opposed to seeing an oyster farm, which by and large looks like buoys on the surface of the water, you know. So I think that's a really interesting thing about what we, you know, find, how, I guess, like history and what we're used to plays into palatability of different things. But, well, first I should say that like plenty of lobstermen don't mind aquaculture at all. Like, they feel like they are not threatened by it. There is like a vocal opposition group that is sort of notorious at this point because it's paired up lobstermen and environmentalists, which have historically sort of really clashed, and they're now fighting aquaculture together through this advocacy entity. But that doesn't represent all lobstermen. And so I think I did my Q sorts with a lobsterman in Jonesport, or actually he was in Beals, but a very intensive lobstering town, sort of exclusively about lobster. And he was sort of a funny one to do it with because he was just like, oh, I don't care about, like, I don't think about aquaculture ever. And that's because no one would be dumb enough to apply for an aquaculture lease in Beals. Like, you're not going to get it. One of the criteria is that it doesn't interfere with fishing grounds. Those are fishing grounds, and it's just not going to happen. And the community would be so mad at you and make sure it didn't happen. I should say another interesting thing is just power dynamics here. Like, plenty of people who want to see aquaculture grow feel really threatened by the power dynamics of the lobster industry. The lobster industry is extremely politically powerful in Maine. And so while they are simultaneously like under threat of enclosure and feeling their livelihoods threatened, they also have a tremendous amount of political clout. And so the interaction of those two things is really interesting. And so I think my answer to you is it totally depends, but you're absolutely right that the lobster industry has a very long history of like staking territory on the water, and they have worked that out with each other. You know, it's a process of negotiation from lobsterman to lobsterman that sort of leaves the Department of Marine Resources out of it. And I think that's one difference, is it's that negotiation is done within the community versus government to community.
So I'm going to go back to online real
Yeah.
quick. How does the stress of the lingering unresolved conflict affect the day-to-day operation of the workers and their quality of life? I guess I'm asking, does your research ask the people on the grounds doing the actual work about their physical and mental health?
Yeah, I interviewed a lot of farmers, sea farmers, and some of, I mean, they feel differently about it, but a lot of them find it extremely stressful. They feel like basically there's huge questions about how this can be a viable business if DMR stays as under-resourced as it is. It's currently a 2-year wait time when you apply for a lease to get the lease hearing. So like you can't plan a business around that if you're working on the margins. That's a huge source of stress. But I would say that this conflict is nothing in comparison to sort of the existential threat of climate change and sort of everyone's real fears about invasive species. I was talking to Steve before the talk about the green crab and how it is decimating shellfish populations, wild shellfish in Maine. And so some of this conflict bleeds into that, where some people worry that it's farmed oysters that are hurting clams' ability to fight the invasive crab, and then other people say it's all climate change stuff. And so I think that those sort of environmental realities and challenges on a day-to-day basis probably impact people's daily lived experience more than the presence of this conflict. But it's certainly a source of stress, and you know, trying to figure out if you can feasibly do this as a business is really stressful, and a lot of growers feel like their attempts to do that are kind of being squashed unfairly.
Hey, Robin, how you doing?
Good, thanks.
Good. This is excellent. I love your presentation. Just have a couple questions.
Yeah.
One, what is, you probably talked about it, what is DMR?
Mm-hmm.
And are Atlantic salmon, my favorite fish, are they considered wild?
Great questions. Okay, so DMR, I should have been clear about that. I should have not used the acronym. Department of Marine Resources, the state agency that manages aquaculture. And so basically DMR is my stand-in for like government when I'm talking about it. And then, are they considered wild? Oh my gosh, Kevin, I could write a whole dissertation chapter on wild versus farmed. I think it is such an interesting question. I will talk about it at length if given the chance. But the question of what is wild and what is farmed is fascinating. And okay, general, just like one step back, not getting in a rabbit hole about it. Farmed Atlantic salmon is not considered wild. Like if it is labeled, so Atlantic salmon is an endangered species. It is illegal to kill and eat an Atlantic salmon. So the only Atlantic salmon you are ever eating is farmed, unless you have poached it, in which case don't tell anyone. So technically it's, you know, the stuff in the farms is considered farms. Any of the remaining, what little stock there is still returning to Maine's rivers that doesn't live in cages or hatcheries operated by Cook is considered wild. And that's where that differentiation happens. But I mean, the history of, you know, like lobster are considered wild, but we've been baiting cages for hundreds of years, and they know to come to the place where they will be fed, to crawl into a cage. So like, is that wild? And then, and we supplement their populations with hatchery raised juveniles. You know, any fish like trout and salmon that not in the West Coast, that you might go fishing for in the wild, almost all of them started in a hatchery. We have been supplanting wild populations with hatchery-raised juveniles since the 1800s. And so this question of where we decide what is farmed and what is wild, I'm working on a paper about it with my advisor right now, but it is endlessly fascinating to me.
We have another question online here, and then I'll come across the room. So this is somebody who runs a fishery consulting company in Casco Bay, Maine. I might have butchered that, so I apologize. They study marine science at Maine and have worked both in fishing boats and aquaculture farms here in Maine. The question is, have you seen trends in this Q survey where in areas that the aquaculture action is being led by the traditionally, formerly full-time wild-caught fishermen, that other members of the public are also more pro-aquaculture?
So no, as far as, so this Q survey, this sort of gets to Elizabeth's question as well, like isn't designed for generalizable findings. So I can't say like, because I saw this particular pattern, this means it exists in the population, like I could with a survey that surveyed thousands of people. But I will say that in interviews that I did with different people along the way, there are definitely places where it seems like the public finds it more palatable. I was just this morning working on my testimony analysis, and I was working on a bill that is related to regulating discharge from land-based recirculating aquaculture, and the bill was going to like severely limit it. Basically, the bill's point was to shut down recirculating aquaculture. It wasn't an earnest attempt to manage its environmental impact. But like there were a bunch of people from Jonesport saying, do not do this. This is so stupid. This is going to stymie economic growth. This is unfair. And there were a bunch of people from Belfast, a town where, these are both towns where recirculating aquaculture is slated to exist. And Belfast is richer and more touristy. And there were people there, basically everyone I've read the analysis from who submitted testimony from Belfast supports it and says this is what we need to protect the environment. This is great. So I do see trends like that, but I can't sort of name them as such based on the Q.
And the follow-up from her, has any of this been published yet?
Not yet. No. Great kick in the butt, though. I'll try.
Do you want to share with her where she can find it once it is?
Well, I don't know yet. Someone published me, but she can email me, and I would be happy to share write-ups that I have and drafts of things. Yeah. Oh, that's true. Yeah, it'll exist in the Duke Library once my dissertation exists in the Duke Library. So that'll be someday.
Thank you very much for this very rich discussion, and I wish you extremely well. I'm wondering whether in your research and deployment of the Q-Sorts survey, your desire was to, or is to, facilitate or enable some kind of mediation or conciliation among the various stakeholding communities, or is it strictly diagnostic on your part as a scientist? And if it's the former, do you also sense some tension with perhaps where you yourself might come down on this set of issues?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. So, you know, for the purposes of a dissertation, it can totally be just diagnostic, but I'm sort of presenting these results when I write about them in a way that is encouraging their use by decision makers and communities to say, like, this is highlighting areas of commonality, this is highlighting potential areas of nuance. And so I would really love for those perspectives to be used in some way to enable mediation. I think the issues that they arise are probably things that the Department of Marine Resources is well aware of. Like, they know that there's a lot of tension about salmon farms. They know that there's a lot of issues about scale. But I do think that there is information there that they can take to understand sort of different levers they could pull on in policy that might be more or less contentious. Because currently a lot of the way it works is pretty dramatic swings from pole to pole about whether we're sort of pushing this forward blindly or restricting it altogether. And I think hopefully this can inform some more nuanced conversations. As far as my own sort of sense of moral and ethics bleeding into it in my own perspective, that happens all the time. It's a thing that I think about all the time. But one of the things I will say is, you know, I went into this work sort of more sure about how I would feel about the different sides than I have come out feeling. I interviewed a lot of people, and they have really different perspectives from one another, and never once did I leave one of those interviews and be like, well, that was BS. You know, like every time I felt empathetic, and I was like, oh, that was a really good point. That was, you know, and so as far as where my own sort of values rub up against these, I see them and I try to point to them when I write about it, but I also think I have a lot of like empathy and respect for the different positions involved. I would like to think so anyway.
So we have hit the end of the time for today. So I want to thank Robin again for coming.
Thanks, everybody.